When you hear the word war, what image comes to mind? Maybe it's thousands of soldiers storming a beach under fire like D-Day in World War II, massed armies, national flags, clearly drawn front lines. But in the modern world, war often looks very different. A drone operator sitting in a windowless room in Nevada, piloting an unmanned aerial vehicle halfway around the world, or a mercenary in civilian clothes operating in a mineral-rich corner of Africa. Or a hacker, maybe state-sponsored, maybe not, unleashing malware to shut down a power grid. These don't look like war as we conventionally think of it. There's no declaration, no marching columns, no trench lines. And yet, nations are weakened, infrastructure's destroyed, civilians die. So in this video, we're going to explore how the nature of warfare is changing and why our international institutions and legal infrastructure are struggling to keep up. Before we can understand how war is changing, we need to understand the model of war we've inherited, the one that still shapes how we write international law, design military institutions, and imagine the rules of global politics. As we discussed in an earlier video, that classic definition of war comes from Karl von Clausewitz, a 19th century Prussian military strategist. In his famous book On War, Clausewitz writes, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." According to this view, war is a tool, a rational act used by states in pursuit of their political objectives when diplomacy fails. In this traditional model, wars have four clear features. First, war is waged by states, and specifically between states. It's conducted by national armies under clear chains of command in the name of sovereign governments. And the battlefield is the place where state interests are contested with flags, uniforms, and front lines. War is also symmetric, assumed to be between roughly equal actors with broadly similar capabilities, tactics, and conventions. The model also assumes conventional weapons and tactics and formal battlefields. There's also a clear distinction between war and peace, between combatants and civilians, between battlefield and home front. In theory, wars have beginnings and endings, normally marked by declarations, ceasefires, and treaties. Finally, even in war, there are supposed to be limits. Over time, treaties like the Geneva Conventions formalized rules about who can be targeted, what weapons can be used, and how prisoners must be treated. The assumption, in other words, is that wars can and should be regulated. Now, to be clear, this model was always, in some ways, an idealization. Civilians have always suffered in war. States have not always followed the rules, and in many conflicts, especially those in the colonized parts of the world, this model never really fit. But this model shaped how states trained their soldiers, how diplomats negotiated, and how international institutions thought about conflict. It gave us a way to define war and, by extension, to try and limit it. But in the 21st century, this model is starting to fall apart. The categories it depends on, state versus non-state, war versus peace, soldier versus civilian, are becoming increasingly blurred, and the nature of warfare itself is increasingly defined by its ambiguity. The actors aren't always states, the tactics don't look like a traditional battle, and the conflicts don't always have a formal start date or a clean ending. We see this evolution occurring across multiple areas. One of the earliest signs that war was changing came in the form of asymmetric warfare, where a weaker opponent tries to avoid a head-to-head confrontation and instead relies on irregular tactics to bleed a stronger force over time. Guerrilla warfare is the classic form. Fighters blend into civilian populations, rely on hit-and-run tactics, sabotage infrastructure, and try to make occupation as costly as possible. Think of the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, who used tunnels, ambushes, and local support to challenge a technologically superior U.S. military. Or the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who used the mountains and external support to resist Soviet forces. In these cases, the battlefield isn't clearly defined. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and as a result, the line between fighter and non-combatant sometimes gets fuzzy. Proxy wars are another way that the lines are blurring, not through tactics, but through layers of participation. In a proxy war, great powers support local factions, often supplying weapons, funding, intelligence, or even fighters, while avoiding direct involvement themselves. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union fought proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan. And today we see Iran and Saudi Arabia backing opposing sides in Yemen, and Russia, the United States, and Turkey intervening on different sides in the Syrian civil war. The result is a local war with global stakes and often devastating impacts on civilians caught in the crossfire. Hybrid warfare takes things a step further. In a hybrid war, states combine military force, cyber operations, disinformation, economic coercion, and unofficial actors to achieve their goals, often without ever formally declaring war. A defining example is Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, which involved the use of unmarked troops, the so-called Little Green Men, who took over key buildings without direct formal connection to regular Russian military operations. This combined with cyberattacks to disrupt communications and propaganda campaigns to flood social media and news outlets with the goal of shaping public opinion. And all of it happened so quickly and so ambiguously that NATO and Ukraine were caught off guard. Hybrid warfare is intentionally confusing. The goal is to create a fog of war so thick that the opponent is paralyzed, unable to formulate a response because they can't be sure what's actually happening. Closely related is the idea of the gray zone, where states take aggressive action below the threshold of conventional war. Gray zone operations are designed to coerce, intimidate, or destabilize an opponent without triggering a formal military response. China's island building in the South China Sea is a classic example. Instead of launching a war, China uses dredgers, maritime militias, and legal ambiguity to assert control over a disputed territory. Similarly, Iran frequently harasses oil tankers, conducts deniable cyber attacks, or supports militias abroad, actions that are serious but fall short of provoking war in the traditional sense. Gray zone operations are hard to respond to because they exploit the legal and strategic gaps between war and peace, offense and defense, state and non-state. But in all of these cases, guerrilla warfare, proxy battles, hybrid and gray zone operations, the same pattern holds. The lines are no longer clear, the actors are often murky, the tactics are blended, and the traditional rules are being rewritten. These broad shifts are reinforced by emerging technologies, which are also shaping the battlefield in profound ways. Perhaps the most visible and controversial transformation in recent decades has been the rise of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. Once used primarily for reconnaissance, drones are now a key component of offensive operations, providing persistent surveillance in areas where deploying troops could be politically risky, allowing for precision strikes on high-value targets, often thousands of miles away from the operator, and expanding the battlefield globally, allowing states to project force into countries they aren't officially at war with. But drones raise serious questions around accountability. What happens when war becomes remote-controlled and people are removed from the decision-making process? The psychological effects of drone warfare. How does the use of drones affect drone operators? And what about civilians living under the constant surveillance and threat of attack and collateral damage? Increased violence. Does reliance on drones reduce the perceived political cost of war for decision-makers, making the use of force more common in international relations? Critics sometimes refer to this as a PlayStation mentality, where killing becomes too abstract and thus too easy. And the spread of violence. Increasingly, drones aren't just tools of powerful states. Non-state actors, including militant groups, are developing and deploying drones of their own. If drones are the present, then lethal autonomous weapon systems, or LAWSs, may be the future. These are AI-powered machines that can select and engage targets without direct human control. Proponents see such systems as a game-changer in warfare, permitting faster reaction times with fewer casualties and more efficient operations. But others, including many ethicists and international lawyers, see them as an existential risk. The core concerns center on three broad areas. First, accountability. Who's responsible if an autonomous weapon system kills a civilian? The programmer, the commander, the machine itself? Second, they also present an escalation risk. What happens if an autonomous weapon system misinterprets a signal or escalates a conflict faster than humans can react? And perhaps more fundamentally, there's an important ethical question. Should machines be given the power to decide who lives and who dies? At the heart of this debate is a question of meaningful human control, and whether that's even possible as these systems evolve. The United Nations has hosted discussions on banning autonomous weapon systems altogether. Groups like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots have advocated for international bans, while the ICRC and many states in the Global South have called for new treaty frameworks. But progress remains slow, and major powers, including the United States, Russia, and China, have resisted any formal limitations, seeing them as essential to future military advantage. And there's a fundamental prisoner's dilemma here. Each side fears that if they don't develop LAWSs, their rivals will, and that someone may use them first or gain a strategic edge that can't be reversed. Consequently, states defect preemptively, building the very systems they might prefer to avoid, a logic of preemptive technological escalation. The third key technological development centers on the emergence of a digital battlefield. This new battlefield space takes two primary forms. In a cyberwar, states or their proxies attack each other's infrastructure, communication systems, or economic targets through non-kinetic rather than kinetic force, that is, through non-physical rather than physical attacks. A widely studied example of this is the 2010 Stuxnet worm, attributed to the United States and Israel. The cyber attack disabled centrifuges in Iran's nuclear program without the need for a direct physical attack. Similarly, Russia's repeated cyber attacks on Ukraine have targeted everything from power grids to banking systems, causing widespread disruption. And attacks on election infrastructure or disinformation campaigns, like those used during the 2016 US presidential election, show that cyber war can also target public trust and political legitimacy. While cyber war targets systems, information war targets perceptions, undermining truth itself as a form of attack. States and non-state actors may use information warfare attacks, including social media campaigns, fake news, and propaganda, to undermine opponents from within. The goal of such attacks isn't to destroy, it's to sow political division, confuse the public, and destabilize the opponent. Unlike traditional warfare, cyber and information attacks are often hard to trace, cheap to launch, and fall below the formal threshold of war. And yet, they can change the outcomes of elections, collapse public trust, and provoke violence, all without a single troop crossing a border. Together, these technologies, drones, autonomous systems, cyber operations, are not just tools. They're reshaping the logic of conflict and raising questions like who gets to use force, where does the battlefield begin and end, and what counts as an act of war. And as these technologies spread, to non-state actors, private firms, and authoritarian regimes, the line between war and peace becomes ever harder to draw. In the classic model of war, the state holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. But today, that monopoly is breaking down, not just because of insurgents or terrorists, but also because of the growing war of private military actors. The use of private actors in war is nothing new. Mercenaries have fought in conflicts for centuries. But in the modern era, private military contractors, or PMCs, have become permanent, globalized industry. In the early 2000s, companies like Blackwater, now Academy, became infamous for their role in Iraq, where they provided everything from logistics to security to direct combat support, often operating in legal gray zones. Today, the industry has grown and evolved. While some contractors still handle transportation, cyber defense, and training, others are effectively serving as armed deployable forces, operating in unstable regions on behalf of governments, corporations, or just themselves. The most prominent example is Russia's Wagner Group, which has been deployed in Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Mali, the Central African Republic, and elsewhere. Wagner blends military operations with economic extraction, trading security services for mining rights, political influence, or access to resources. It operates with plausible deniability, allowing the Russian government to project power without direct attribution or political blowback. To be clear, Wagner is not a rogue force. It's a tool of Russian foreign policy, tailored to operate where Russia's official armies can't or won't go. The privatization of war raises serious legal, moral, and strategic questions. Many operate outside of traditional military codes of conduct, and jurisdictional loopholes make prosecution difficult, especially in weak states or conflict zones, and raising questions about accountability. Their critics ask, who's responsible when PMCs commit war crimes or violate international law? When private security forces do the fighting, states outsource a core function of governance, the control over force. And in some cases, host governments might become dependent on foreign contractors for regime survival, raising questions about sovereignty. In many cases, PMCs operate in former colonies, reinforcing patterns of external control, resource extraction, and political instability. And finally, private military contractors operate under a different logic than national armies. Their incentive isn't peace or victory, it's contract renewal and profit. In this system, war becomes a business, and instability can be good for business. As a result, in the 21st century, we're seeing the rise of what some scholars call marketized warfare, a world in which the tools of violence are no longer held exclusively by states, and where global corporations can rent force, export violence, or wage war beyond borders. And like drones and cyber tools, this development blurs the traditional boundaries of war. Is a country really at war if its soldiers wear different flags or none at all? And if governments can outsource violence, can they also outsource responsibility? From battlefield tactics to global strategy, these shifts challenge everything we thought we knew about what war is and who fights in it.